Alrighty, good evening, everyone. Welcome to week one of administrative law. I love teaching this unit. I'm really excited to have you guys joining me this evening and throughout the rest of this term. It's a hell of a ride, administrative law, but it's a good one, and it's one that I try and make as enjoyable as possible for you. So I'm very excited to have you guys. I think the summer semester is a good time to be doing administrative law. On the one hand, those weird breaks over Christmas, do kind of disrupt things a little bit. But at the same time, I find that administrative law is often a subject that, you kind of need to, I suppose, digest a little bit more slowly. And so having those extra weeks over Christmas, I think, does give you a little bit more of a chance to, think about some of the issues and ideas that we raise over the next, over 12 weeks. So you've definitely picked a good time to jump in and study administrative law. So this evening, I'll start off by talking, I suppose, a little bit about these tutorials and give you a brief overview of how they're going to run. Then we'll talk through a couple of housekeeping issues, and then we've got some discussion questions to leap into. So to begin, these tutorials are first and foremost a chance for us to have a conversation and a back and forward about administrative law and the different topics and ideas that we'll be considering each week. So I am very keen for this to be a really participatory experience. And so with that in mind, we run these tutorials with a couple of ground rules, pretty straightforward. I expect you to treat each other with courtesy and respect. When we have quiz weeks, don't give away the quiz answers. Please do make sure that you are participating. I know from previous terms that the people who come along and even just have a go, you don't have to be right. Just having a go, being part of the discussion will really help you in leaps and bounds in this unit. It really is the kind of subject that, you don't always know what you don't know until you get stuck into it. And then at least we can have a back and forward, we can have a conversation, and please make sure you're asking questions. Because I don't know what you need help with until you let me know. So I am really keen for you guys to be involved. Absolutely. In terms of what we're going to cover in these tutorials, really what I try and do is focus a lot more on the practicalities. So your lecture videos, your study guides, your textbook readings are there to give you, I suppose, the foundational knowledge to deal with administrative law. In the tutorials, we then try and apply that knowledge usually to hypothetical problems and questions. And what we'll generally do each week is kind of give a quick overview of the material. And really what I'll do is I'll draw out some key points or ideas that I really want you to focus on. There'll be time for questions, and then we'll jump straight into those tutorial problems, and there'll be plenty of time for discussion. And then I'll turn that discussion into, I suppose, a framework or a structure for how you would go about answering an assessment question based on those kind of problems. And so in following that process week after week, you'll find that by the time you go to do your midterm task and then your end of term exam, you'll have plenty of practice thinking about, okay, how do we deal with these administrative law problems? Because really it's quite a formulaic subject in terms of if you can structure your answer and hit all the points that you need to week after week after week, it is actually reasonably straightforward. A lot of the complexity comes in the detail, but once you've got the format and the structure, you're off to the races. So that's something that we really emphasize in those tutorials. So, making sure that you're coming along and engaging with that will help you so much in terms of the assessment. Speaking of assessment, I did want to flag, in case you haven't seen it already, this term, the midterm assessment due in week 7, which is all the way after the Christmas break, is a group work assignment. So you'll be in groups of 3. There's a thread on Moodle to help you organize some groups. You've basically got 2 weeks to form a group. If you're not in a group by the end of then, I'll put you in a group basically. But if you're having trouble finding someone, there's countless ways to get in touch. Get in touch with me as well, and I can, try and pair people up as well. If you're lost or need a third member or whatever. But we'll talk more about the assessment in the coming weeks. But the key thing I want you thinking about now is getting into those groups, finding people that you feel like you can work with. And having a read through of the problem so that you kind of know there's 3 roles that you can choose from, and they're basically the same, but each of the 3 roles is representing one of 3 clients. Each of the 3 clients has similar problems, but slightly different. And so you might read through the problem and think that you want to represent a particular client. And so being able to find a group who's going to, allow you to do that basically, it might be important to you. So making sure that you're being proactive and prepared in that front is pretty important. That probably covers it for some of the housekeeping and some of the initial groundwork. Was there any questions or comments or concerns anyone had about the unit as a whole that they wanted to bring up before we get underway?
Jacob, if I might, just a question.
Yeah,
I just came in at the end of your comment in relation to constitutional law. Mm-hmm. Do you foresee any particular issues? I'm doing it at the same time. That's why I guess I ask that.
Okay.
So is it manageable, do you think?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And yeah, it's definitely manageable. In some ways, it might be a good thing because, constitutional law and administrative law together form, I suppose, a little public law bubble. And it requires, I suppose, a way of thinking and a way of approaching ideas and problems that is a little bit unique to other subjects. And your colleagues who have studied constitutional law will that'll be fresher in their minds than it is for me. But it requires a sort of a different way of thinking. And so if you've done constitutional law already, people find that they can get into admin law a bit easier. But at the same time, you might find that you can just really immerse yourself in the 2 subjects at once, and that sort of mode of thinking. So it shouldn't be a problem. If you do run into any difficulties, there's some overlap in terms of some of the theories and principles. So if any of that's new to you, of course, more than welcome to reach out via email, Moodle, Teams, however you want. But yeah, it's definitely is manageable. It's just, it takes an awareness that it's a challenge and you manage it, and then it's fine. Any other questions? No worries.
I just wanted to say thank you, Michael, for that question. I had the same question because I'm also doing the same unit, so that sort of clarifies.
Perfect. Yeah. It's sort of funny the way the T3 units kind of clump together a bit. You have a fewer choices, and so we see some interesting patterns. But yeah, it's absolutely manageable, and yeah, you can really get into that public law mindset. Any other questions? Excellent. Well, let's get underway. Let's talk admin law. I thought we could warm up this evening with a couple of pretty easy true or false questions. Well, 2 true or false questions, 3 true or false questions, and a multiple choice question. So the first one, true or false, and maybe the easiest thing to do is to just put a T or an F in the chat box. True or false, administrative law focuses on the decisions of the executive government. Lots of trues popping up. Perfect. Excellent. So yeah, really in administrative law, we're sort of, and in a Westminster-ish system like Australia, the lines of legislative and executive government are of course blurred a little bit, But here we're really mostly interested in the decisions of the executive government. So the branch of government that administers the law, that enacts and enforces regulation and things like that. So really what we're thinking about typically is bureaucrats, public servants making fairly day-to-day decisions about how different things run, how different policies are implemented, things like that. So yeah, focusing on the executive rather than legislative branch of government. Next one, true or false? Administrative law is not concerned with public accountability. Excellent, lots of falses. So yeah, we are concerned with public accountability, right? It's a lot of what we do is focused on the individual and the way that an individual is impacted by a decision of the executive government. But in doing so, there is still an important public accountability element, right? The executive government, runs the state or the country sort of for everyone. And a poor decision that affects one person potentially affects, everyone or a lot of other people as well. And so we want to make sure that the executive government is held accountable and that accountability is in plain view for everyone so that we can have faith and trust and confidence in the decisions that the government makes, because we know if they make a bad decision, they'll be called out on it and there'll be consequences. That's the idea anyway. Multiple choice question now. Which of the following sets of parties would you expect to find in an administrative law dispute? So I might just, I'll share my screen for that one so that you can see the different options. So which of the following sets of parties would you expect to see? A, employer-employee, B, the Crown and the accused, C, executive government and people or corporations, D, person and corporation. All right, I can see the chat box filling up there, so I'll stop the screen share. I'm assuming, yeah, we've all put C. So yeah, the executive and people or corporations. Invariably, that's what we're looking at here. Some kind of department, government, agency, branch, sub-component of the executive government, and some person or corporation who's been affected by that decision. Perfect. Alrighty, last question, another true or false. True or false, I'm looking forward to studying admin law this term. Lots of trues. You're either lying or very kind. It's fine if you put false, right? It's I am very much aware. It is very much a loaded question. Yeah, I'm aware of admin law's reputation, right? And I think it's important that we acknowledge and address that right up front in week one, because to some degree, the reputation is deserved, right? It's not necessarily a straightforward subject. It's not necessarily an easy subject. And so, of course, that's going to, bring with it some trepidation. But at the same time, being aware that that's the reputation, I do very much try my best to make it as simple as possible, as straightforward as possible, as interesting as possible. Sometimes I succeed, sometimes I don't, and that's just how it is. One thing that, two things that will help. First, please make sure that you're asking questions throughout this term whenever you're finding stuff is confusing, hard, problematic, because it exists, right? There will be topics and ideas that you'll find difficult. Make sure that you're asking questions first for your own sake so that I can help clarify things, but second for everyone else's sake, because chances are if you're finding it hard, other people find it hard too. And, you know, every year it's something different. And so it's hard for me to preempt what exactly it's going to be. But every year there's something that comes up that people, it just doesn't gel with them, gel for them. And I'm more than happy to, you know, pull together a couple of extra videos, pull together a few different resources or extra readings or whatever it is, to help explain it, get things kind of going again. And it's important that you, I suppose, do that as we go along through the term rather than waiting for the end, because I think it might help you to think of administrative law as a little bit like a jigsaw puzzle, right? And not because it's puzzling, but because, you know, with the topics that we talk about over the next few weeks, the pieces do all sort of link together in a particular way. And what is good and quite satisfying, I suppose, about that is that once you figure out how those pieces all fit together, then the sort of administrative law picture is quite easy and straightforward, and you can see it and you can figure it out quite nicely. But what's tricky is that when you can't quite see how the pieces are fitting together, it can be very frustrating and you want to just chuck it all back in the box and never look at it again. And, you know, I get that. But it's really important that as we go along, you do ask questions, you do kind of, you know, let me know when those bits aren't quite fitting together properly for you, so that we can work it out then and there. Because if you don't get the first few pieces down, then you're going to find it really hard to fit the rest of the puzzle together as well. So making sure that you're engaging with this unit week in and week out, and making sure that you're asking questions as we go along is really useful and really important. The other thing, I suppose, to you know, really beef out this puzzle metaphor is, you know, when you're doing a puzzle, what gets you through is being able to see the art on the box that tells you what picture you're going to try and make with the puzzle. If you haven't seen it already, I've done kind of an overview of the unit video. The tile format in Moodle kind of hides it away, which is tricky. So I've moved it into the week 1 folder as well. But if you haven't seen that already, please do check it out, because that is kind of like the box art for the administrative law puzzle. And it does help you to know where we're going week in, week out, because the way the weeks all fit together is an important part of understanding administrative law in general. It's not like, something like criminal law where, you do like murder one week and then like, theft another week. And it's, if you don't quite get murder, it's fine, because next week you're on to stealing or robbery or something. And you can just park that for later. Because we're building week on week on week with admin law, if you miss the boat early, it's a lot harder to catch up. But it's a good thing too, because it means that once you've got the puzzle picture all together, it's much more straightforward, and the weeks all kind of reinforce each other, and you'll be doing really well. So that's my waxing lyrical about the beauty of admin law, and also, recognizing that there are challenges, and that it's more than okay to find it challenging. The important thing is that you do reach out when you hit those road bumps. Any questions or comments on that one? Awesome. It's got its reputation, and we do what we can with it, I suppose. We might move on then, if there's no questions on that one, to talk about some of the tutorial problems or questions that we've got for this week. This week, they're much more of, I suppose, a discussion. Most weeks we'll be dealing with a more concrete hypothetical scenarios that are really geared towards particular ideas and preparing you for assessment tasks. But this week, we haven't hit any of the substance stuff yet. So we're talking instead, I suppose, a little bit more on principle and being a little bit more discursive, which is fun as well. So the first question is, what kinds of administrative decisions does the government make that affect your life? In other words, how could admin law be relevant to you? And, obviously you don't have to share more than you're comfortable with, but, every term we do have some really interesting ideas and ways that, admin law touches all of our lives.
Anything really, like visa decisions, your normal grants, Centrelink, those kinds of decisions. And
Yeah, absolutely. Those are some good examples. I think, Kira, it looked like you were about to say something as well.
I was going to go on the same lines, and something recently I just paid my rego. So that's one of the examples that affects us. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. So vehicle registrations is another, a good one. Yeah. What else? Who's been vaccinated for COVID? Who had to get vaccinated for COVID? That's increasingly one of those areas that we are going to find, or we have already found really, in terms of government decisions about who is strongly recommended to get vaccinated, but they're not going to make you, versus people who they're going to say you get vaccinated or you don't have this job or you don't go to this place or whatever it is. So that's an interesting area of government decision making that has just emerged in the past few months. Passports, absolutely. So that whole process in terms of, and visas as well, absolutely. So thinking about the requirements, the identity, I suppose, requirements for to enable you to leave the country, and then also the rules and requirements to allow people to visit Australia as well and to stay in Australia. Definitely. Anything else? We could really go on all night, right, about all the different things, because it is buying and selling houses. Yeah, absolutely. So thinking about, all the extra costs and stamp duties and regulations and all that sort of stuff. Yeah, it's a really good one. Yeah, we could be here all night thinking about all the different ways, because government decision making is so pervasive in modern society and does just affect everything. Licenses, absolutely. So driving being the obvious one, but also liquor licenses, gaming licenses, all those sorts of things. Marriage, government grants. Yeah, absolutely. It's really interesting, I think, just how far this stuff extends. And as a consequence, administrative law is such an essential, topic of law, because of just the sheer number of ways and varied ways that it can affect you or affect, potential clients down the track. Absolutely. Tax audits. Perfect. That's going to segue nicely into question 2, which is whether anyone has had any experience with the system of administrative law, particularly in dealing with administrative agencies, either at Commonwealth or state level. Have you had to ask for a reconsideration or review of an administrative decision? So again, obviously, don't share anything more than what you're willing to, but again, we do hear some interesting stories, and I thought I would kick things off with one of mine. Before I, started living the academic life, I worked in tax law, which is, I suppose, a specific subset of administrative law. And one client that we had that really stuck with me, he owned a seafood restaurant that was audited. It was audited for a couple of years. and basically the tax office said that he'd been claiming too many expenses, and as a result, he owed, however many thousands of dollars tax debt. Now, the problem was that the tax office had actually made a mistake in its calculations. He had actually done the right thing, but it took, and I was trying to remember just before how long it actually took. I think it was 5 years in the end, the whole process of review, challenging the decision, appeals, etc., etc. And eventually he did win, right? He was right all along, and it just took that entire process to actually, have that decision rectified in the end. But it was such a journey, it was such a battle that it basically cost him everything. He lost the seafood restaurant business, obviously. The finances of it cost him his home, and the stress of it all cost him his marriage, right? He came to the end of this with, a rectified decision, but at the cost of basically everything else in his life, and 5-ish years that he could never get back. And I think, that's something that really has stuck with me ever since then, because it really does show, for one, the just extreme power of executive decisions and the way that they can impact people's lives. And it also, I think, does show the, responsibility that we have as administrative lawyers to, promote the public accountability and administrative justice that admin law tries to provide. But, that's just one example. I'm interested to hear if anyone has any examples of their own.
I recently had the Centrelink question as well about the claim, the all study claim about overpayment and stuff, and I had to do like a formal review. I think it's the form says 58. So during your lesson, I was just keep thinking of my personal thing. Anyway, it just got me that one of the clauses that it was written at the bottom is that if you are not able to pay, one of the options that the government offers is to ban you from your own country. And that was pretty scary, to be honest. I don't know, it's a small fine, but it got me that like the extreme of the sentence, like you can be banned to come back from your country. So it was bad.
Yeah, absolutely. It really does highlight, we talk in the previous question, right? We talked about the extent to which government decisions affect our lives, on a day-to-day basis. And then, absolutely, the extension of that is when they make a particular decision, it can, have flow-on effects to other aspects of your life too. Absolutely. And the Centrelink and, going back a few years, the whole Robo Debt stuff as well. It's, it's always an area of administrative law that produces, let's say, interesting decisions. Anyone else? Thanks for sharing that, by the way. Anyone else?
I've actually been in the government in Centrelink as an officer before, so I know what it's like to make those decisions. But more over the years, I actually help people with the visas and represent them at the AAT. So the whole interest in this particular unit is for me to fine tune and understand the difference between court appeals and the AAT. So I really want to, that's what I'm finding very interesting. I really want to get it right in terms of understanding the differences and applying it to my work. So absolutely, I deal with decisions all the time. So
fantastic. Absolutely. 2 comments on that. First, we kind of keep the AAT or sort of merits review stuff and the judicial review stuff. We keep that fairly separate in the unit, just from, I suppose, just to keep things simple, and it can get a bit, confusing when we sort of bring the two together and jump back and forth. But absolutely, at the end of week 3 or at the start of week 4, remind me to talk a little bit in the tutes about that as well, because yeah, there is, we treat them as separate for simplicity's sake, but absolutely it is much more of a, I suppose, a continuum in terms of how AAT stuff moves on to then courts as well, definitely. So we can definitely revisit that for sure. The second thing I should say, of course, in this unit, this unit is basically 12 weeks of why governments make poor decisions and what we should do about them. But I wouldn't want to suggest for a minute that all public servants make poor decisions. And yeah, absolutely. Having done my PhD on law and public policy, I do know absolutely the conditions and the challenges that public servants face that, sometimes they can overcome brilliantly, and that sometimes, lead to questionable decisions. But yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely. Enjoyed that your point with, after being on the other side of the fence, like, helping people with visas when they're refused, and some of them are really ridiculous decisions. I sort of find that if I was an officer again, I would really frame my structure my decisions a bit more precisely and address it. But yeah, I absolutely get what you're saying, and which is why I find this unit very interesting, in future, to actually sort of make better structured decisions and actually deal with the decisions a lot better. So yeah,
absolutely. And there's staffing problems, there's just the sheer churn and the volume of decisions that there's a whole host of challenges that public servants face. Absolutely. And yeah, we will probably lose a lot of that nuance in talking about how we hold governments to account, but absolutely there's more to that story, of course. Anyone else?
I am actually one of the Robo Debt people. That
there you go.
Is still, so it's still ongoing, and the last apparently letters will be received this week regarding the class action as to what category you're in. My situation was that I rang and questioned it. I was told that the computer had worked it out, and that if I wanted to argue about it, then I had to prove that I hadn't been overpaid. There was no way that they could say to me, yes, you had. Yeah, it all came back onto me. And so I made a decision just to pay it. So it was easier than the administrative work that I needed to do to go back 5 years to bank statements. And then, somehow became part of the class action.
Yep, absolutely. We don't talk a ton about Robo Debt in this unit, mostly because it's fascinating stuff, but mostly because the exact nuances of the problem was actually with how the machine calculated the debt, rather than the really interesting question of, why are we allowing computers to do all this? So we don't talk about Robo Debt, one, for those reasons, two, because it, has still been ongoing. But I'm really looking forward to, when we can have a bigger, fuller discussion of Robo Debt, because it is really interesting. And it raises an interesting point, the sort of the reverse onus. And it's the same thing in tax. We talk about, in criminal law, innocent until proven guilty, right? It's one of those fundamental legal tenets. In administrative law, we don't really have that. And in particular elements of tax, especially, social services as well, it is actually flipped in terms of the government's decision is, what's treated as true, correct, right, whatever. And the onus is on you to prove that they were wrong. And if it's relating to a supposed debt from 10 years ago and you haven't kept your records for 10 years because, you've moved houses 3 times, and of course, how are you going to find that again? Too bad. So it's a tough piece of the law. Absolutely. So yeah, I hope things work out well for you then. In the chat, we've got, so the issue is that the algorithm was wrong from day one. Absolutely. So it was, yeah, and you know, we won't go into all the details of it because yeah, it's quite technical, and admin law is technical enough as it is. But yeah, the issue was the way that the computer was calculating the debts in terms of averaging income over the years and stuff, which yeah, should have been seen, you know, picked up as an issue, but it wasn't, and here we are. Any other experiences that anyone would like to share? Perfect. Well, we can leave that there, and thanks everyone for yeah, sharing your experiences and having your input. And you know, I think this really does go to show that this is a topic, and these are challenges that potentially affect all of us. You know, certainly affect, you know, people who we know or who are in our lives, and all that sort of thing. And you know, I think that's what makes admin law so interesting and so important, is that, as we've said, because governments have such extensive power, and you know, it affects our lives in so many different ways, we do have to be aware of, you know, the consequences of those decisions, and be alert to that, I suppose. Let's move on into some, I suppose, a bit more substantive or questions that get a little bit more to the heart of administrative law. The first one is, in what ways can executive government decisions be reviewed? What are the different sort of means of reviewing a decision?
Is that either merit or judicial?
Yep. So those are the two key ones that we will talk about in this unit. So absolutely. So judicial review going through the court system, or merits review, which is, you know, still within the executive branch of government, going through a tribunal like the AAT. So yeah, those are the two key ones. In the chat, Preeti's mentioned internal reviews as well. So quite often you'll have a process where, in the first instance, if you've got a problem with a decision, the first step is to go to the decision maker themselves and say, I think there was a problem with this, I need you to fix it. And they go off and do their own internal review. We kind of skip over that step in this unit because, you know, either they go, oh yeah, I stuffed up, and they fix it, in which case it's sorted, or they double down and they say, no, you're wrong. And then you end up needing the rest of the process anyway. So internal review absolutely is an important means of addressing or challenging a decision. But yeah, it's one that we don't spend too much time on. And then another means is a complaint to an ombudsman if there is a relevant one. So, you know, public service ombudsman, tax office ombudsman, there's a few of them around. But yeah, it's the ombudsman's an interesting one because it's you know, independent-ish, I suppose, and it can be a really useful means of review, but it's also you know, a little bit tricky. You have to, for one, get your foot in the door, which is tough, and then, you know, from there there's not too much control over the process and things like that. So it can be tricky, but absolutely it's an important means of review as well. Perfect. Alrighty. This one is perhaps more directed to people who have already studied constitutional law before. How would you distinguish administrative law from constitutional law? I said at the start that, you know, they both fall under the public law umbrella. What's the main or interesting differences between them?
for someone who's only just started his reading, as I indicated, doing them concurrently, Constitution in my head, it sort of said it's about it gives the head of power or the authority of the government to make a law, whereas the administrative law is talking about the review of the decision that's made under that law. So one's about the power to make it, and one's about decisions made then subsequently under that law, or the review of those. Could be wrong.
Yeah, no, so that's good sort of in terms of thinking about two different parts of the process. Yeah. I'll park that. It's a good starting point. I'll park it, get some more answers, and then we'll come back to it as well. But yeah, great start. Any other thoughts?
I will say that the executive, as we said before, is between the executive branch and persons and corporation, whereas constitutional is between the judicature power, and then that can be subdivided between the state and person, or like the Commonwealth at a state level, or the Commonwealth or a federal level.
Yep. So absolutely. So thinking about people who might be, or parties who might be engaged in an administrative or constitutional legal process. In administrative law, yeah, we're thinking about the executive government and then people or corporations. In constitutional law, yes, we can still sometimes have people or corporations and government, but we can also have governments sort of duking it out amongst themselves, right? State versus state, or states versus the Commonwealth level as well. So it can be a, within government dispute, but different jurisdictions. Yep, absolutely. In the chat, Preeti's talked about delegation and separation of powers and the basis of the executive decision. So I think what's really interesting about the separation of powers comment is what I was going to sort of revisit with Michael's point, is that when we're thinking about administrative law, we're thinking about the executive branch of government. And when we're thinking about constitutional law, we're thinking about the legislative branch of government. So with what Michael was saying about, there's heads of powers that say what laws the government can make. We're thinking about what legislation can the legislature, pass, what are the kinds of things that they can make legislation on. And then for administrative law, we're thinking about, okay, they've passed that law, it enables them to do different things. And then based on that, the executive has made a decision and it's had flow-on effects to particular people, corporations, and they're, having problems with that. So yeah, thinking about the separation of powers, legislative for constitutional law, executive for administrative law, is a neat way of compartmentalizing the two. And then of course we've got the judiciary acting as reviewer of both, right? That's the whole idea of the separation of powers. Absolutely. I suppose those are the really key differences. Are there any similarities you think between the two?
I will say yes.
Okay.
Because we are still, I think in the executive, we are still arguing as a legal issue, like statute, for example, and how it actually affects the people that is complaining by the review. And then the statute itself it's coming from the constitutional part of things. So it's, I think, all related.
Yeah, absolutely. So
I'm guessing.
Yeah. No, it's a good point. And this is, I think this sort of comes back to our discussion before about, how the different ways that the government decisions can affect us, and people recounting their experiences with administrative decisions, is that at the end of the day, what's really interesting about administrative law and constitutional law as both kind of falling under this public law umbrella is that fundamentally both are interested in people and the general public, and the ways in which government power affects us as people. In constitutional law, we're thinking, I suppose, in broader terms, and in the sense that, you know, the ways in which legislation can affect maybe the population as a whole. When we think about, you know, legislation that might infringe implied freedom of political communication or freedom of movement, which has been a big one recently. Whereas in administrative law, we're perhaps a bit more fine-grained and looking at individual decisions impacting individual people. But, you know, at the end of the day, both are really take the citizen as the unit of interest and importance. Absolutely. Any other ideas about, you know, how these topics might be similar?
Yeah, in terms of like some of the duties, like there's a bit of overlap. Like there could be a minister who's more dealing with bills and legislation, and then at the same time they are also executing their power through delegation. And similar with the Merits Review Tribunal as well, they are not fitting under the judiciary; they're actually more under the executive function, the administration. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, two great points. So first, thinking about, yeah, this kind of Westminster model of government and this idea of responsible government, where ministers are both, you know, the high level people within the legislature and the high level people within the executive. And, you know, that on the one hand, that's really good, right? Because it gives us as citizens a bit more say over who is running the executive arm of things, because they're accountable to Parliament and therefore the people. But at the same time, yeah, it does create this interesting overlap and grey area in terms of the separation of powers. It means that, you know, they're separate-ish, and at the very top, they are, you know, a lot much closer together than, say, you know, in the US, where you do have much more separate branches of government. So yeah, that ministerial level is an interesting, quite concrete overlap. And then, yeah, thinking about the whole, you know, the exercise of judicial power and, you know, the idea of you know, Chapter 3 courts and all that sort of stuff, feeding into merits review, not exercising judicial power. That's really interesting. We'll talk about that in week 3. But then also the idea of judicial review and judicial power being, I suppose, quite protected, and the courts being really reluctant to, I suppose, step past what they see as their role in judicial review. That's a really important theme that we're going to keep coming back to sort of in the second half of the term. This idea of, you know, this is what a judicial review is. This is how far a court is willing to go in reviewing a decision. But then once they hit that mark, they're not going to go past that. And you know, in the particular weeks, I'll talk about, you know, what that line is, why they won't go past it, why that's interesting in relation to the particular topic for that week. But yeah, absolutely. Thinking about judicial review and the limits of judicial power is an interesting idea for sure. Any other thoughts on that one? Excellent. So yeah, so you know, it's there are some similarities, some important differences, and you know, this is why I say you kind of, if you've done constitutional law already, you know, you're kind of set up with a lot of these ideas and principles, and you just maybe applying them in a different way. If you haven't done constitutional law yet, it's not a problem, because, you know, we kind of build up those ideas in the particular administrative context anyway. And if you're doing both at the same time, then, you know, you can just live in the fantastic public law bubble for the next 3 months and you know, have a lot of fun with these concepts in their different domains. week in, week out, which is cool as well. So, you know, there's an interesting relationship, but from a study perspective, you know, you can make it work no matter where you are in your studies. Last question for this week. One, have you heard of the Administrative Appeals Tribunal? It's come up a couple of times this evening, but for one, have you actually heard of it before? If you haven't, that's fine. We talk about it a lot in week 3. But if you have, what's your impression of it? Is it part of the federal court system or the executive? And why might that distinction matter?
I do a lot of work with the Administrative Appeals Tribunal. So yeah, so they're not a part of the judiciary as far as I understand. They are more independent in that context, but under the executive, they will usually hear a case. It could be like a court, or they're happy to look at facts and new information, which is why it's termed merits review. So yeah, and they would recommend a decision back to the relevant department, or they would affirm, and that's when someone can appeal at the court level.
Yep, absolutely. So the key thing is, yeah, that the AAT provides what we call merits review, and we talk about that in a lot more detail in week 3. But what's important is that merits review is still in the executive branch of government and not in the judicial branch of government where the courts sit. And that has a range of really interesting implications. The key one being that because they're not a court, because they're not exercising judicial power, they're not, I suppose, constrained by the same limitations that I was alluding to before about, you know, the court sort of sees where its role is and it won't go past it. Because merit review isn't put in that judicial review camp, it can actually kind of go past where that line is. And you know, in reviewing a matter, certainly they can send it back to the original decision maker. Certainly they can affirm the decision. A court can do that too. What's really important for the AAT is that they can actually make a new decision. And because they're part of the executive, that's a really key power that they have, is they can say, well, we're still in the executive camp. We actually think that based on all this information, the decision should have been A, not B. And so we're going to make decision A instead. And then that's the new decision. And then, you know, you go off and, you know, do with it what you will. Whereas the courts, fitting in their little judicial review bubble, they might look at a decision and they might equally conclude, yeah, that decision B, that's not right. That shouldn't have happened. But they won't take that next step and say, oh, well, we'll make decision A instead. They will only go as far as saying decision B was wrong. And then they send it back to the decision maker to, you know, try and get it right this time. So that's a really key distinction between the two. And Preeti, you've got your hand up there.
Yes, sorry, Jacob, on that, thanks for that's something new I've learned. So with the merits review, when they choose to either affirm is a different thing, when they choose to remit, as we call it, or make or substitute the new decision, does it depend on the regulations of the particular decision that it's coming from, the relevant department, or is it more a choice that they exercise in terms of which decisions they can overturn with the new decision, or which ones they would remit it back? That's one thing I'm not very clear on. So I've just, because I really liked your point with regards to how they choose to make that decision.
Yeah, absolutely. So we'll talk more about that in week 3. Sure. But I suppose the AAT Act, which is the baseline, you know, rules for the AAT, gives it the AAT its powers to, yeah, affirm, remit, make a new decision, etc. So the baseline from the AAT is that they can make a new decision, but, and we'll talk about this more in week 3, but the AAT Act and the AAT's authority only arises if the primary legislation, so say the Social Security Act, Income Tax Act, you whichever act the original decision was made under, it will say whether the AAT is allowed to review a decision or not. And if it doesn't say, then you don't get merits review, which kind of sucks. But if it does, then the AAT can jump in, or you can take a matter to the AAT is a better way of saying it. But that primary act can also modify elements of the AAT Act, including, you can go to the AAT, they can review a decision, but they can't make a new one or something like that. So there's nuance in that primary act as well. But the base assumption from the AAT Act is that they could put a new decision forward if they wanted to.
Thank you.
If you're feeling lost by that conversation, don't stress. We'll talk about it a lot in week 3. Okay. So, don't start the term feeling lost. We've got plenty of time to go through all that. But the key takeaway, I suppose, is that the AAT, absent anything else, the AAT can make a new decision, which is really important distinction from the courts. A couple of other things, just because I'm looking at the time, a couple of other interesting distinctions from the AAT versus the courts arise in relation to rules of evidence. So rules of evidence don't apply to the AAT, but they do in a court, obviously. Often they try and keep things pretty court-like, but they have a bit more flexibility around those rules of evidence, which is interesting. AAT is usually cheaper than the court system. Still not cheap, but cheaper than the courts. And they can review issues of fact and policy as well, because they're sitting in that executive branch rather than, the judicial branch can only look at issues of law. But we talk much more about that in week 3. So, if that's whooshing past, don't worry. We come back to it in a couple of weeks' time. Any questions or comments before we wrap up this evening? You can go in and look at recent reviews. There are a few interesting ones on their website. Absolutely. What is really cool too about the AAT is, they do have a very wide, I think, now I forget the number. There's about, I think it's 400 bits of legislation that refer review powers to the AAT. So, there's a huge scope of topics and things that they can look at, which is really cool. But yeah, other than that, we'll bring it to a close. So, this week we've talked, I suppose, a little bit about administrative law and why it's interesting, hopefully, and important. And we've talked about some of these fundamental ideas about the executive government, the relationship to other elements of public law, some of the nuances of different types of review, which will be, rediscovering in later weeks as well. Next week, we really do begin in earnest thinking about the review process and we've got a decision that we think is not right or is problematic. What the hell are we going to do about it? And that's, we start that next week, and then that's what we spend the whole term then really thinking about. And so next week we look at access to information and we think about, okay, we've got this decision, we think it's wrong, but before we do anything else, we're in an information gathering step, do a bit of recon, do a bit of, find out a little bit more about the decision, so that when we go to challenge it, when we go to review it, we've got all the relevant information that we need to make a really strong, powerful, persuasive argument. So next week, we sort of take our first steps into that review process in this access to information stage, which is, it's a good place to start, I think, because it's, quite a logical departure point for thinking about reviews. So looking forward to seeing you all then. Of course, if you've got questions, comments, concerns in the meantime, feel free to jump on. There's so many different channels to get in touch these days. And the other thing, of course, is to start thinking about finding a group. I know a lot of you have been on Moodle already, but if you haven't seen that, please do make sure that you jump on, you find yourselves a team, and you can start thinking about working towards that assignment in a couple of weeks' time. So fantastic. Thanks all so much. I'm really looking forward to spending this term with you guys, and I'll see you all next week. Have a good evening. Bye.